The Great French Revolution is, without a doubt, one of the most magnificent and one of the most inspiring periods in history. France in 1789 was a country with an increasingly hated despotic regime. There was extreme inequality and misery for the vast majority. And this misery got worse as the state became entangled in an enormous debt crisis, in part caused by waging wars that they couldn't afford. So the France of 1789 doesn't actually look that much different from the world today. But within a few short years, every last vestige of feudal oppression had been thrown into the fires of revolution. And all these hated forces in society, the aristocracy, the church, and the rotten court clique around Louis XVI had seemed to be invincible. But in the end, not a single one of them could withstand the unstoppable power of the masses in revolt. So I think the first thing to say about the French Revolution is that its history has been, to quote the Scottish historian Thomas Carlyle, buried under a mountain of dead dogs. That is to say, the real history of the revolution has been buried with falsehoods and slander. And even though the modern European capitalists are the descendants of the bourgeoisie that were actually the main benefactors of the revolution, the actual event fills them with dread. The central task of the French Revolution was to clear the way for capitalism, to pave the way for the development of capitalist interests and capitalist property, and to enable the achievements at the time in productive technology to be exploited. And it accomplished this, of course, but it wasn't accomplished by the capitalists, by the bourgeoisie themselves. It was led by the bourgeoisie. This is true. In particular, it was led by the most revolutionary elements of the lower middle class, the petite bourgeoisie. But it was carried out by the masses. And at every stage, the mainspring of the revolution was the movement of the most oppressed sections of society. And it was the intervention of this layer that was the decisive factor that pushed the revolution forward and enabled it to complete itself. And this is why the bourgeoisie today treat the revolution, and especially its more radical phase, with such contempt. Because they were terrified of the masses and the methods that they used to change society, just as they're terrified of the working class today. So yeah, even though this was a bourgeois revolution, that is a revolution that prepared the way not for socialism, but for the rule of the capitalist class, this period is an absolute storehouse of lessons for those fighting for communism today. And the great theoreticians of Marxism all went to great lengths to study these events in detail. Lenin considered that the Bolsheviks were modern Jacobins. And Trotsky once said that it's not possible to understand the Russian Revolution without first having understood the French. It's a classic example of how the process of revolution and counter-revolution develops. And it's not an accident that the greatest minds in history placed so much emphasis on the need to understand this period. So everyone who truly seeks to change the world absolutely must make it their mission to take up a detailed study of this period. So the French Revolution wasn't accomplished all at one stroke. It actually took place over a series of revolutions and counter-revolutions over a period of about 6 years. But there were two distinct phases to the revolution. And this is actually characteristic of just about every revolution, actually, because this is a movement of the oppressed. They're coming out of the darkness, so to speak, for the first time. And when they do that, they inevitably bring all of the illusions and the ideological baggage from the previous period with them in these first stages. To imagine that the masses could move forward constantly and overcome every obstacle as it meets it would be absurd. When the masses first move into action, they don't actually understand all of the political forces that they're up against. And when they meet these difficulties, it takes time to understand them and ultimately to crush them and to move on to the next stage. So the revolution never takes place in a straight line. And the first phase happened from around July to October 1789, from the storming of the Bastille to the mass march of Parisian women to bring the king from Versailles back to Paris. And then there's a bit of an ebb for a period of about 2 years, followed by a renewed revolutionary offensive. And the second phase lasts from around June 1791 to June 1794. Starting with the attempt of the king to flee France and join up with the counter-revolutionary armies coming from the east. And the high tide of the revolution was expressed in the revolutionary dictatorship of 1792, the overthrow of the monarchy up to the coup of Thermidor in 1794. But the main task of the revolution was to clear the road for capitalism in France. But even under the absolutist regime, there were pockets of capitalist development. Trade with Europe had increased by 5 times in the century prior to the revolution. You had great commercial centers and ports growing up in cities like Nantes, Bordeaux, Marseille, and of course Paris. And this was an embryonic capitalism. You had large-scale enterprise, but it was very limited. And you can actually see this by comparing it to British capitalism, for example, in the same period. If you compare the number of spinning jennies, and this spinning jenny was a kind of machine that was used in the production of cotton textiles in the period of the Industrial Revolution. And in 1789, there were 20,000 spinning jennies in Britain compared to only 900 in France. So the majority of production was done at a small scale on semi-feudal lines. And out of this early capitalism comes early class relations. In other words, the lines between the classes were much blurrier, I guess, than they are today. There wasn't really a working class in the same sense that we understand in the modern sense. It's better described as a kind of a semi-proletariat. In a sense, it's the working class just as it's being born, as you like. A good portion of the urban poor were basically ruined peasants from the countryside that had drifted to the towns looking for work. And the vast majority of society was rural. Rural peasants made up about 85% of the population. And serfdom had been abolished for the vast majority. But this only improved conditions for a tiny minority of the peasants, while for the vast majority, things got even worse. And even though the peasants were no longer really tied to their lords, they were still subject to what were called the feudal rights, which is basically this extremely complex network of taxes and toll charges, rents, ties to the church, and on and on. And just to give an example, not only did the peasants have to give up a portion of their harvest to the lords, but the peasants often had to also wait to sell their grain on the market until the lords had actually sold all of theirs first. So this is just one example of one of these many privileges and customs that had been crushing the poor from every side. And it even got worse in the years leading up to the revolution. The ruined nobility, sections of the ruined nobility, began resorting to basically digging up all kinds of forgotten rights that hadn't been levied for centuries. And then there was this whole industry of basically legal experts that arose around this, whose job it was to basically squeeze blood from a stone, squeeze the peasants for everything that they had. And this was compounded by a series of bad harvests in the years leading up to 1789. The conditions got so dire that by 1777, over 1 million people were officially classed as vagrants, basically landless peasants with no means of earning a living. And this is an astonishing figure, especially when you consider that the population of France at the time was only around 28 million. And at the other end of the spectrum, you had the court circle and the wealthy nobility who were living lives of decadence and basically extreme luxury. And the crisis also had its ideological reflection in the writings of the philosophes. These were great writers, like Rousseau, Montesquieu, Diderot, and Voltaire. And it's characteristic of all revolutions that the winds of change first blow in the ranks of the intelligentsia. And they made a thorough-going critique of the whole rotten regime and provided the rising bourgeoisie with the philosophical premises for its attack on the old order. These were the general causes of the French Revolution. And the immediate cause was the financial crisis of the old regime. The monarchy and the state were involved in a series of wars. And the last of these was the American War of Independence. And France was involved in this war on the American side. And this is very important, actually, for two reasons. The first is that the French soldiers that went to America to fight in the war came back to France with the ideas of the American Revolution in their heads. They basically participated in the war for the overthrow of a monarchy with all of these ideas of liberty and democracy that came along with it. And this had a very powerful effect on the psychology of the urban poor in particular. And so that's the first reason. The second was that these wars totally bankrupted the state, not unlike today. And it created a massive financial crisis for the regime. And the main question underlying all of this is the same question that is the driving force of every revolution. Who will pay for the crisis? The fact was that the poor couldn't pay. And the rich wouldn't pay. The aristocratic nobles actually had never paid tax owing to the privileges of the nobility that had been conferred on them from birth. Louis XVI, the king, appointed a whole series of financial reformers in an attempt to avoid total financial collapse. You have a whole series of names, people like Turgot, Necker, and Calonne. And for a period, Necker performed financial miracles, which basically consisted in getting loans from capitalists. And Calonne actually even went as far as to invent a whole new policy, which he called useful splendor. And this was basically the idea that the court circle and the upper nobility that were living at Versailles should be allowed to spend as lavishly and as ostentatiously as possible, so that basically their bourgeois creditors would see all of this and think, well, you know, everything is very well in the royal house, and surely they couldn't have any financial problems if they're living this well. So I think, yeah, the aristocracy took a bit of a shining to Calonne, as you can probably imagine. But there's a problem. I think Margaret Thatcher might have had some choice words for these nobles. The problem with monarchy is that eventually you run out of other people's money. Then, yeah, eventually the loans ran out, and they had to be paid back. And this brought the regime to the edge of bankruptcy. And inevitably, this brought the court of the king into a direct confrontation with the nobility, who were flatly refusing to pay any tax to the state. And this took the form of a struggle between the court and a group of organizations called the Parlement. Now, the Parlement weren't parliaments in the modern sense. They were basically like regional assemblies of nobles that acted kind of like a law court. And their main responsibility was to register royal decrees. So basically, a decree of the king wouldn't be passed into law until it was promulgated by the parliament of a given province. And the nobility began to delay registration of the royal decrees, which effectively turned the parliament into power bases in the struggle against the king. They said, oh, we're defending our liberties, by which, of course, they meant their freedom to not pay tax. But in order to gain a base of support for this, they appealed to the people. And for a time, the masses actually supported the parliament against the king, even though both sides in this struggle were their class enemies. The nobles would say, oh, yes, look at this draconian king and how he treats us. We demand our liberties. And the masses, they heard this, and they agreed with it, but they interpreted this idea of liberty from their own class point of view. And I think there's a modern analogy here. There's a similar phenomenon that's taking place in front of our very eyes, and that is the election of Donald Trump, the rise of right-wing populism. Now, I should start this with a warning, right? These are very different historical periods that we're dealing with, and the relationships between the classes are very different. So this analogy has its limits and can only be used to really draw general lessons. But nevertheless, who is Donald Trump? He's a billionaire and a demagogue. Trump speaks a lot about the American workers, but does he fight in their interests? No, absolutely not. Donald Trump only cares about the interests of Donald Trump. But nevertheless, in order to gain a base and support in society, he's demagogically whipping up all of this anger against the establishment that exists in society. But he's playing with fire, because sooner or later, the working class who are currently looking to Trump for answers will be disappointed. But it will be very difficult for the American ruling class to put the genie back in the bottle now that it's been let out. Lenin and Trotsky explained this. They said, revolution always begins with splits at the top. And in the case of France, it was the struggle between the nobility and the court of Louis XVI that precipitated the whole process of revolution that eventually stripped both sides of power. And this will inevitably be the case in the present period as well. So yeah, a whole series of riots in support of the Parlement broke out in cities like Bordeaux, Brittany, and Paris. And the possibility of a nationwide revolt was brewing, and this is what forced the king to back down. And eventually he called the Estates General, which was a meeting of the representatives of the three orders in French society, which, if you know your French history, this was the nobility, the clergy, and the so-called Third Estate, which included everyone that didn't belong to either of the upper privileged orders. And the Estates General hadn't been called since 1614. So this was an attempt at a concession, but in the general context of a social crisis, this had an explosive effect, right? Basically, the masses began to look to this body as a solution to their most pressing problems. The people were asked to fill out lists of grievances. These were the famous cahiers de doléances. And the attitude was, well, these people know what our problems are, so let's see what kind of solutions they provide. And in the end, they were to be disappointed. But yeah, the undemocratic nature of the Estates General became this massive source of resentment. There was two orders representing the clergy and the nobility, but they had enough votes to cancel out all of the votes of the Third Estate, which represented about 98% of French society. So under this pressure that was brewing from the masses, the bourgeois representatives plucked up a little bit of courage and demanded some extra representation to cancel out the advantages that were held by the upper classes. And the king and the nobility forgot all about their earlier conflict when presented with these demands. They closed ranks and they refused to budge. So the Third Estate decided to separate themselves from the other orders. They declared themselves the National Assembly. In other words, the only legitimate representatives of the French people. So yeah, having recognized, I guess, the dangers in the situation a little bit too late, the king began to prepare an armed coup. Was basically preparing a massacre to put down the movement by force. And the signal for this was the dismissal of Necker, the king's reforming minister. But as Marx said, sometimes the revolution needs the whip of counter-revolution to drive it forward. So on July 14th, 1789, the people rose up, raided the Invalides Palace in Paris, took 28,000 muskets from the palace, and stormed the fortress of the Bastille. And this is how the coup of Louis XVI was defeated. The king was forced to come to an agreement with the National Assembly to share power. And from here, the movement rapidly spread from Paris into the countryside. The peasants took up arms, they set the chateau, the residences of the feudal lords, on fire, and they tried to destroy all of the papers that listed the feudal rights. They didn't trust the National Assembly, they didn't trust what was going on in Paris, and they decided basically to take matters into their own hands. And in this context, you have this infamous night, the night of the 4th of August, which was basically a meeting of the assembly, ran into the early hours of the morning. If you read about this, to be honest, it sounds like a meeting of one of these evangelical churches. Like all of the assembled representatives had, seen the glory of the revolution and were driven into raptures. It was like each one of these, people would stand up in turn and denounce the feudal system and renounce some tax or toll that was a burden on the peasantry. No more tithes paid to the church, no more salt tax, and so on and so on. Basically, everybody was trying to outdo each other. Until by the end of the night, like the whole, every last vestige of feudalism had been just completely torn to the ground. And then the next morning, all of these, bourgeois gentlemen woke up with a bit of a hangover and clarified that what they had actually done was to sell the feudal rights for a fee. So basically, instead of, paying taxes to your lord every year, maybe you would pay for 20 years up front, and then they would lift the tax. After all, one thing to remember is that at the time, it was possible for bourgeois to actually buy some of these noble titles. So many of the people who were representatives in the assembly actually themselves were the people exacting the feudal dues. So obviously, it's not very good business to simply give them all away. The truth was that the representatives in the assembly were terrified of this plebeian movement that was sweeping the country, and they were trying to placate the movement with fine words just to get it to die down. And in a similar vein, on the 27th of August, you had the famous Declaration of the Rights of Man, which, again, contains very fine words about liberty and inalienable rights. But for the masses, these declarations are totally useless, right? The average, peasant would look at this and think, well, what use of declarations like this when there's nothing to eat and there's no work? But yeah, what was behind all of this? The deputies in the assembly were the representatives of the big bourgeoisie. They wanted to get concessions from the king and the court and take measures against the aristocracy, but they also wanted to keep the people in their place, right, which was out of politics. Through all of this, none of the problems of the masses have been resolved. All of this hunger and poverty in society was still very widespread. And on top of this, the masses rightly feared that the royal family might leave the country and join the counter-revolutionary armies that were massing to the east of France. So you have this very dramatic event, which ends the first phase of the revolution in October 1789. The spark for this was a banquet that was organized by soldiers that took place at the residence of the royal family, the Palace of Versailles. They'd be doing a lot of drinking, and the Flanders Regiment started singing royalist songs. They took the revolutionary cockades out of their hats and they stamped on them, and they replaced them with white cockades because white was the symbol of the monarchy of the Bourbons. And this was the spark that set off a second insurrection. On October the 5th, you had a demonstration of about 7,000 women who marched from Paris to Versailles in the middle of the night. This is about 20 kilometers for reference, in the pouring rain. And then they were followed by a detachment of about 20,000 National Guardsmen, who I believe had actually been stationed to prevent this kind of movement, but they actually ended up defecting to the revolutionary side. And the women, they went to Versailles, they petitioned the National Assembly and the court for bread. And fearing for his life, the king appears on the balcony, side by side with Lafayette, who is the leader of the National Guard. And the people demanded that the king be taken to Paris to be kept under the watchful eye of the people themselves. So you have this procession of about 30,000 people marching back to Paris with the king and queen in a carriage and installing them in the Tuileries Palace in Paris. And this marks the end of the first phase of the revolution. And as far as the capitalists, as far as the bourgeois were concerned, the revolution was over. They'd got what they wanted, which was a compromise with the king. And feudal rights, of course, had not been abolished. They'd been put on sale. Now, this compromise was only possible in the first place because of the revolutionary movement of the masses, but they got next to nothing out of it. There was a constitution, but it divided the mass of people into so-called active and passive citizens on the basis of property ownership. I believe Camille Desmoulins has a quote about this. He says, well, it was the active citizens that stormed the Bastille, but of course, the bourgeois didn't have anything to do with that. And church land had been nationalized by the state. But the majority of that was then sold to the wealthy. And above all, of course, the monarchy was still in place. So from this period, October 1789 to 1791, the movement went into a bit of an ebb. But when the first phase of a revolution begins to recede, the counter-revolution always sees an opportunity to try to recover their former position. So the royal family had been planning their escape from Paris for some time. But on the night of the 20th of June, 1791, they saw their opportunity and they escaped and headed east with the hope of linking up with the reactionary armies in the east to attack Paris from the outside. Now, fortunately, the king was recognized during his escape and was arrested at Varennes and brought back to Paris as a prisoner. Scandalously, the assembly was more frightened by the reaction of what the people would do, and they tried to hide the facts of what happened. They said, well, the king had not tried to leave of his own free will. He'd actually been kidnapped, which was an outright lie. But yeah, this was a decisive moment for the revolution because the escape totally undermined the idea of this compromise with the king in the eyes of the people. Their illusions had been totally broken, and now that they could see that this was not really a compromise. Basically, as long as the king remained, there was a danger of counter-revolutionary restoration. And about a month later, you also had a mass demonstration at the Champ de Mars, which is a large field that used to be used for military drill exercises. Today, it's the park just next to the Eiffel Tower. And the demonstration was in support of a petition demanding the end of the monarchy. But on that day, Lafayette, the commander of the National Guard, opened fire on the crowds, and dozens were killed. And this, together with the flight to Varennes, served to sharpen the polarization in society. And this was around the time that the political clubs and secret societies became a mass phenomenon. And the most famous of these, of course, was the Jacobin Club, which started as a single club in Paris, but rapidly spread throughout the country. And eventually, there was more than 1,000 Jacobin clubs throughout all of France. And closely related to this was the famous Cordelier Club in Paris, which was led by Danton. And this was a peculiar club because you could join it for free, which meant that this club was actually the one that was most sensitive to the pressures of the poor. And these clubs were kind of like embryonic political parties. They started as debating societies, basically, but they developed into centers of organization of revolutionary activity, kind of analogous to a Soviet in the Russian Revolution. And the polarization in society and the formation of organized political tendencies was also reflected in the new legislative assembly, which had just had elections. So out of 745 deputies, 264 were right-wing constitutional monarchists like Lafayette. 136 were associated with the Jacobins and the Cordeliers. But the most influential at this stage were the Gironde deputies, so-called because they came from the Gironde region in the west of France. And these deputies represented the interests of the big mercantile bourgeoisie from places like Bordeaux and Marseille. And the Girondins were basically the party of capitalist law and order. They stood in defense of the revolution, but they were terrified of the independent movement of the masses and wanted to keep them out of politics. And they were also the party of war, which is important because this was quickly becoming the decisive issue for revolutionary France. Austria and Prussia were linking up with royalist exiles and were preparing to march on Paris. And the Girondins were the most determined faction in favor of war. And this was for a few reasons. First, it was clear to them that as long as there was a counter-revolutionary threat, both internally and externally, they would never be able to calm the masses down and rule in their own interests. But they also wanted war because they thought that by sending all of the masses to the front, it would weaken the movement in Paris, and that would enable them to consolidate power. But they weren't the only ones. The Girondan War agitation actually corresponded with the interests of the royal family, if you can believe it. The army had basically been taken over unchanged from the old regime. So you have this army where most of the generals were themselves aristocrats, or they had close ties to the royal family, and they were eager to basically betray the revolution at the first opportunity. There was actually only one person in the assembly who was opposed to the war, and this was Maximilien Robespierre, who was one of the greatest revolutionary leaders of all time. And he opposed the war mobilization because he saw that the internal counter-revolution would take advantage of this so-called revolutionary war. And in a famous speech to the assembly, Robespierre said, "If you think this is a war to complete the revolution, you will be betrayed. Turn your eyes to your own internal position and do not go to face the enemy with other enemies at your back." And though he was in a minority of one, he was shown to be absolutely correct. The French declared war on the aristocratic coalition on April the 20th, 1792. And the army was poorly trained, ill-equipped, and went basically from defeat to defeat. And amongst the troops and the masses, this hostility began to grow towards the generals. You had mutinies breaking out. One general, General Dillon, was killed by his own soldiers. And of all of the officers involved in the campaign, fully one half went over to the side of the enemy. So this created a very dangerous situation for the revolution. You had counter-revolutionary armies with French officers at their head moving towards Paris. The king dismissed the Girondin ministry and replaced them with right-wing monarchists. And on top of this, there was a new counter-revolutionary provocation from the Duke of Brunswick, which was called the Brunswick Manifesto. And basically, these armies are advancing, and the Duke of Brunswick says, once we get to Paris, anyone associated with the revolution in any way will be subject to summary justice. Basically, this means that a total bloodbath was being prepared. And had it happened, it would have made the later revolutionary terror look like a walk in the park. And this situation is what led to the development of a new mass uprising. On the night of August the 9th, 1792, having no confidence in the Legislative Assembly, the masses formed a new revolutionary government in Paris, which is the Insurrectionary Commune. And the following day, they stormed the King's Palace at the Tuileries and effectively overthrew the monarchy. So this was a situation that was very similar to the period of dual power in the Russian Revolution. The Commune was a center of plebeian political power. It existed alongside the Legislative Assembly as a counterweight, asserting constant pressure on it. And the masses also flooded the political clubs and the Parisian sections, which were actually originally bodies that had been convened in the pre-revolutionary period to elect delegates to the Estates General. But under the pressure of the masses, they were given a completely different content, basically transformed into centers of revolutionary power. And 47 out of the 48 Parisian sections declared for the overthrow of the monarchy. So what was happening was that the center of power was passing from the debating chamber to the streets. And the struggle was reflected in the Legislative Assembly and took the form of a fight between the Girondins and another fraction called the Mountain, so called because they sat on the highest benches in the assembly hall. Now the delegates of the Mountain were also bourgeois, like the Girondin, but in the main they came from the lower middle class, the petite bourgeoisie, the artisans and the shopkeepers. They weren't themselves members of the urban poor. But what distinguished them most from the Girondins was that where the Girondins recoiled from the revolutionary masses, the leaders of the Mountain clearly understood that they needed to rely on the masses in order to drive the revolution forward and prevent the monarchists from gaining the upper hand. The leaders of the Mountain were some of the most outstanding representatives of the French Revolution, people like Marat, Robespierre, Danton, and Saint-Just. And they were a minority in the assembly, but they had a mass base of support in the Commune and in the Paris sections. So what you had in effect was a plebeian dictatorship. This was a situation where the masses held power in their hands, and they were using it against the rich and the powerful that had betrayed them. Just to list some of the revolutionary measures that were taken in this period, any priests not supporting the revolutionary people were given 15 days to leave the country. Special people's courts were set up to try counter-revolutionaries. Any armed groups or forces inside the capital that the people weren't sure of were disarmed or arrested. House-to-house searches were carried out, and speculators or profiteers that were trying to make money out of the shortage of food were arrested. And the masses also carried out a plebeian terror This is the September massacres. You had detachments of the poorest section of the population, which went into the prisons because they had heard that when the counter-revolutionary armies had got into Paris, they were going to open up the prisons and use, counter-revolutionaries, criminal elements, and so on, basically to massacre the people. So you had these improvised tribunals that were set up in the prisons. The figures say that around 1,100 to 1,400 people were put to death. So this is, a very grim episode in the history of the revolution. It's no doubt that some of these people weren't actually counter-revolutionaries, but I think the thing to keep in mind is that for the masses, this was a life or death situation. In a matter of days, basically, with the army knocking on the door, the fate of the revolution was to be decided, and had the counter-revolutionaries had their way, all of Paris would be drowned in blood. So yeah, just days before the massacres, the fortress of Verdun had fallen to the enemy because Dumouriez, who was one of the aristocratic generals, had betrayed. And once Verdun had fallen, the way was open to Paris. So the masses had basically already been betrayed by the Girondins once. They weren't about to take their chances again. And the Girondins, who were still a majority in the assembly, they basically had to accept all of this. On one occasion, the revolutionaries in the streets executed some counter-revolutionaries, and they put their heads on spikes, and they went into the assembly, and they showed the Girondin deputies these heads. So, I think it shows the balance of forces. I think it also might have helped to inspire the Girondins with some patriotic fervor a little bit. But yeah, this was also the time that slavery was abolished in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, which was inspired by the French Revolution. And they also found support in the revolutionary armies of Paris that went over to help the slaves fight against their slave owners. So this was the high point of the revolution. The feudal rights were finally abolished. Measures were taken to relieve the poor at the expense of the rich. And the distinction between active and passive citizens was abolished. But I think actually one of the most spectacular changes in this period happened in the military, which had been completely transformed. And you can see this at the Battle of Valmy on September the 20th. This is a very important, one of the most important battles in the whole revolution. Basically, the Prussian troops faced an army unlike anything they'd ever seen before. It was almost more of a demonstration than a battle, to be honest. Right? You had basically the French soldiers. They went out and they put their hats on their bayonets and held the line, shouting "Liberty, liberty," and singing revolutionary songs. And the Prussians actually they fired back. They fired their cannons into the soldiers, but the lines didn't break. And what happened was the Duke of Brunswick is there watching all of this unfold, and he's horrified because he can see the psychological effect that this is happening on his own troops. And he actually had to withdraw his troops into Belgium because he was afraid that they would defect. If you listen to bourgeois historians talk about this period, they are completely confused by this. They have no understanding of why this is happening. But this was a colossal victory for the revolution. It had a massive effect on the Parisian masses, boosted their confidence, and helped to drive the revolution forward. And yeah, every army ultimately reflects the society that created it. That is to say that all of the contradictions in the army are reproduced in the armed, or excuse me, all of the contradictions in society are reproduced in the armed forces. And under capitalism or class society, armies are characterized basically by extreme top-down centralization and basically a reign of terror in order to maintain discipline. But the French Revolutionary Army was completely different. The aristocratic generals had been purged, and it became a volunteer army that was under the control of the people. And although they were untrained, dressed in rags, some of them actually barefoot, they swept all of these extremely well-trained mercenary armies from all of Europe and scattered them like the wind. So how was this possible? Well, the difference was they knew what they were fighting for. They believed in it, and they were willing to die for it. And this is what made them practically invincible. And there was one man who was present on the battlefield that day, on the side of the Prussians, Wolfgang von Goethe. And he wrote, this is now on a monument at Valmy on the battlefield. He said, "On this day and in this place begins a new era in the history of the world." I think that's very significant. So back in Paris, all of the contradictions between the factions were beginning to crystallize. The Girondins and the vacillating middle elements in the convention were moving sharply to the right, while the Jacobins, under the pressure from the masses, were moving left. And this reflected the intensification of the class war. The big bourgeoisie had basically made fortunes out of military contracts, financial speculation, and the purchase of church lands. Meanwhile, the mass of people were suffering from shortages and depreciation of the currency. And there was still a threat from counter-revolutionary armies abroad. Spanish army had crossed the Pyrenees, Prussians were invading to the east, and Toulon had been surrendered to the English. And on top of all of this, there was a counter-revolutionary uprising developing in the Vendée, which is a region of France in the west. And the Girondins began to organize counter-revolutionary uprisings in the provinces, especially in the strongholds of the big bourgeoisie, places like Marseille and Lyon. And this led to a final uprising of the sans-culotte masses on May 30th, 1793. And after 3 days of insurrection, the convention was finally purged of all of the Girondin deputies, and the mountain was left firmly in control. And the expulsion of the Girondins led to a generalization of the Civil War. They began to wage an armed struggle against the revolution, against Paris from the provinces. So this was the period of the Revolutionary Terror. Basically, the revolution in this stage required draconian measures in order to defend itself. So there was measures taken against free enterprise and profiteering. Controls were put on prices, resources were requisitioned. Basically, the masses wanted to decide what was produced, in what quantity, and for what purpose. And you had the Committee of Public Safety, which is the kind of governmental committee that's at the head of this movement. And they said, while we respect the rights of private property rights should be subordinate to the public interest. So basically, this was a war economy. In which the masses who'd been involved in a life or death struggle at home and abroad were basically holding the capitalists by the throat, getting the resources that were necessary to conduct the war. They wanted to veto any contracts by factories that weren't related to the war effort or were satisfying the needs of the people. And this was combined with the levée en masse. And this was basically a mass mobilization. It was a massive effort to form a people's army on a greater scale than anything that had been done before. And these gigantic revolutionary efforts got results. Lyon and Bordeaux, which had fallen to the Girondins, were taken back in the autumn of 1793. Toulon was taken back in December, and at the same time, the insurrection in the Vendée was finally defeated. And then, on June the 26th, 1794, at the end of this revolutionary war, you had the victory of the Battle of Fleurus at Belgium, which finally eradicated any serious threat on France's eastern borders. Now, from this date, from the end of the war, this is when the revolution really starts to enter into decline. The fortunes of the revolution and the war were actually very closely linked with each other. Basically, what was happening was the easing of the military situation led to a change in the relationship between the classes in Paris itself. You had this terror that was directed against the counter-revolution, and in the exceptional measures of the war economy, all of this lost their justification. And the mass movement also started to recede. There was, a certain element of exhaustion. The masses were tired, right? And this is kind of understandable, given the titanic efforts that had taken place in the last years. And on top of this, when the revolutionary army started to be demobilized, the revolutionaries came back to a situation that wasn't really that different from what they'd left, right? There was still poverty. There were still the difficulties of everyday life. Unemployment in the countryside was the same as before, at least for the poorest sections of society. And therefore, the movement started to decline and slid into inactivity. And on top of this, the Jacobins themselves were also, they were petit bourgeois. We can't forget about this. They basically made temporary inroads into private property in order to maintain the revolutionary dictatorship in its hour of need. But to move any further would start to threaten the very foundations of capitalist property. And this wasn't in their interests. So once the threat from the counter-revolution receded, Robespierre began directing blows against the left, which ultimately undermined his own base of support. And finally, Robespierre was overthrown on the 9th of Thermidor, which is 27th of July, 1794. And he was executed the following day without even a pretense of a trial, together with more than 90 Robespierrists, his supporters, were all guillotined. And from this point on, France slides into counter-revolution, which finally led to the dictatorship of Napoleon in 1799. And with the defeat of Napoleon at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1814 and 1815, the monarchy was finally restored. So yeah, many superficial historians will look back at all of this and ask if it was worth anything at all. It's the old French phrase, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, which means the more things change, the more they stay the same. But the restored Bourbon dynasty was nothing like the feudal regime of pre-1789. This was a regime that was built on a completely different social foundation. All of the filth of the old regime had been cleared away. All of the land had been distributed to millions of peasant smallholders, and this smashed the power of the aristocracy for good. So this was the French Revolution. It was a bourgeois revolution from beginning to end, although obviously it wasn't carried out by the bourgeoisie. Marx explained this. He said the bourgeoisie was really the class at the head of the movement, and even where the lower classes acted against the bourgeoisie, like in 1793 and 94, they were basically just struggling to bring about the triumph of the bourgeoisie, although not with the methods of the bourgeoisie. Basically, the whole of the terror in France was nothing more than a plebeian method of eradicating the enemies of the bourgeoisie, which were absolutism and feudalism. And there could be no question of socialism at this stage. The masses that carried out the revolution weren't a modern working class. The wage-earning class at this time basically only existed in embryonic form. So it was not possible for the revolution to go any further. But that doesn't matter for us, right? This revolution was a titanic struggle of the oppressed. People were driven by the hope of a world free of oppression, of inequality, free of oppression, inequality, and exploitation. And it had this colossal effect, not just in France, but around the world. It gave the spark to revolutionary movements of liberation across Europe and beyond. And it even led to the development of whole new schools of art. The old classic, stuffy classical school that was favored by the aristocracy was smashed, and the door for the Great Romantic Revolution was open, which was an entirely new artistic, literary, and musical school. And Beethoven himself was an ardent admirer of the French Revolution. So yeah, we are revolutionary communists fighting for a better world, and we proudly claim the French Revolution as a part of our heritage. And in modern times, where the working class makes up the crushing majority of society, well, we are heading for a new revolution, which will open the way for a new social order in which these ideas that the French Revolution inscribed on their banner of liberty, equality, and fraternity will no longer be this stinking hypocrisy that it is under capitalism. And I'll end on this. One of the revolutionary papers in Paris was called the Révolution de Paris, and the subtitle on this paper was this: "The great only appear great because we are on our knees. So let us rise." Thank you.